listening to Females in Fantasy, a podcast elevating the voices of women authors of science fiction and fantasy who write about kick-ass heroines. I am your host, Brianna Da Silva, and this is Season 2, Episode 7. There's a little problem with that intro, though. The topic of female characters and speculative fiction is bigger than just books, and I've been wanting for a while to expand this conversation beyond authors. Today, we're going to do just that. I sat down with Kelsey Eng, who is an illustrator and works for Dreamworks TV. She's worked on a number of different shows, including the new She-Ra series, directed by Noelle Stevenson, which, side note, that just came out on Netflix, I think a couple weeks ago. I binge-watched it in 2 sessions, and I loved it dearly. And I was really excited to have Kelsey on to talk about the topic of female characters in fantasy and how it applies to mediums like art, animation, and games. Well, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Here's Kelsey. Welcome, Kelsey, to Females in Fantasy. How are you doing this morning?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be on your podcast.
Oh, yay. I'm so excited to have you on. And this is the first time, so this is like a little bit different for listeners. The first time I'm having someone on who we're not going to be talking about books strictly. But that was something that I wanted to do a little bit more of in this season anyways, kind of expand a little bit and talk about like media in general and how women are perceived in fantasy, not just in books. So, to start off, tell us a bit about yourself. Who are you, Kelsey? And how did you first start getting into illustration and all that?
Okay. So I guess usually interview writers, and I'm more of an artist, and I like to draw mostly digitally using Photoshop. And I use a digital tablet for that. And I started drawing ever since I was younger, but mostly with traditional media like crayons and stuff in kindergarten. And right now, I work in animation during the day. So I work at Dreamworks TV, and I worked at other animation studios in the past. There's kind of set jobs in animation, like background design, character design, storyboard artist, storyboard revisionist, and currently I'm a storyboard revisionist, but I've done design in the past as well. And I do freelance illustration in my own time.
Awesome. That is so cool. When I saw that you were working for Dreamworks TV, I was like, what? It was funny because our first interaction, so I first found you on Twitter, which is true for most of the people that I end up bringing on the podcast. Mm-hmm. For some reason, I end up meeting a lot of people. And I think it was for the Visible Women tag. I think that was what you were doing.
That one, yeah.
Yeah. For anyone that doesn't know what that is, could you explain what that hashtag is real quick?
I guess it's just a hashtag on Twitter that you can tag your art or tweets with, and people can just find you more easily through the tag. And I guess if you're a woman on Twitter, you can tag your stuff with it. It's more just a way for other women to find each other and stuff. Is that correct?
I guess so. I mean, I'm not an artist, so I don't use it, but I'm always lurking on the hashtag because I love art. So
for some reason, I didn't know it was just for artists. I thought writers could use it as well. But
I don't know. See, I would think maybe, but every time I only ever see artists on there. I don't know, maybe other kinds of artists. I guess art is a pretty broad term, but maybe it's not just illustrators, but I've just never personally seen that. Because at first I was like, oh, let me use this. And then I was like, wait a second, it's just people drawing.
It's funny. It's supposed to be used on a specific day, but I think I was a day late or something. And I was like, oh, hopefully people will still see this. But I think luckily, some people I know retweeted it, so I was like, "Oh, thank you."
Yes, which worked out, and it was funny because when I was first replying, and I was just like, "I love your art," and then I was asking about if you did commissions, and then I realized that you work for DreamWorks TV, and I got embarrassed. And I was like, "Oh no, maybe she doesn't do that," but apparently you do. So what drew my got my attention about your art was, the fact that it's fantasy and it's women, obviously, and it's really cool. But specifically, there's something refreshing about the fact that most of the time whenever I see fantasy art, and I do think this is getting better, but the standard default, even if you just do a basic Google search, right? You just find so much objectification and sexualization of women, and that's whenever you see fantasy art, that's usually what's there. And so and that's kind of annoying. Every time I see that, a little part of me cringes, but then I'm also so used to it that I don't like, it doesn't really, I'm just kind of like, oh, there it is again. And so then when I see some art that, some fantasy art that shows women that are warriors or whatever they are, like witches or queens or whatever. And then I'm seeing them being like portrayed more like people in like really empowered ways and not like sexy little objects with funny like armor that doesn't even cover them. And then that really stands out. So, and also I just loved your art. But yeah, so why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that like fantasy art that features women is like so often objectifying? And like, I don't know, what's your reaction to all that?
Oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate the compliments. I think, I'd say a lot of the artists I see that do that are male artists, and I don't know if they just think their like consumer audience is mostly male audience too, so they like play to that. But I've also noticed like, some female artists do it as well, and I'm like always curious like if it's like a empowering thing, like they just like want to like say like, oh, like it's okay if we do it too. I've always like wondered about the logic behind that. I think personally I just like to draw like women who are fully covered up and with like, like proper armor and that type of stuff. I at first I didn't realize that I did that. It wasn't like a conscious thing. It was more just like, oh, I think this is how this should look. Not like preaching to anybody. It's just like I grew up with like, strong female role models, and those were like the type of books I was naturally drawn to. I wasn't like, hey, I'm just gonna read a bunch of books where like there are strong female characters. It just happened like that. Like Tamora Pierce and like Mercedes Lackey and like just a bunch of other books like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I wonder about that too, because like, because another interesting like nuance to this that I think is important to include is the fact that like some women and girls like do feel empowered by, like really, really sexualized things, right? Or like, you'll see people like going to conventions and stuff sometimes like dressing that way. And like, for some people that's cool. It's like, there's a difference between like just kind of enjoying their body, right? Versus someone else objectifying it, and yeah, and I feel that sometimes that people don't really catch that there is a difference. And yeah, so I don't know, it's interesting. What do you think? What do you think the difference is between something being sexy and something being objectifying? What, in your opinion?
I feel like it's probably like on the beholder, right? Like I think inherently the person can do whatever they want, but it's like up to the person looking to like either induce like shame or, like, oh, hey, that looks cool, or, the different range of emotions that can come with like any outfit. I'm definitely not like the preeminent like thinker on this subject, but just like a casual opinion.
Yeah, no, that's cool though, because like I like hearing from your perspective as someone that illustrates, right? And I'm just someone that likes to look at illustrations. But yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way. That it really is pretty subjective, because like even what like modesty standards differ from culture to culture too, right? So like,
oh yeah,
that's
as well.
Anyone that travels, especially a woman that travels, will in places with pretty different cultures, will learn that like, oh, sometimes you'll be attracting weird attention if you dress in this way that might be normal from where you're from, and so yeah, I hadn't thought about that can kind of apply to art too, and like costumes, and sometimes it is in the beholders. I like, yeah.
That's interesting that you say that, because I recently went to like northern island in Japan, like Hokkaido, and it was like a lot like it wasn't like as I feel like as like super modern as Tokyo, so like a lot of the fashion was like a lot more modest. So I was like, oh, this is so different from being in LA where everyone's wearing, well, and also the temperature might have played a part too, because I guess it was slightly colder there, but it was like interesting to see the different fashion choices like that were in the culture as well.
Yeah, it's funny how like depending on literally the weather and temperature, like people will develop certain types of clothing that is practical, and then they end up over time applying like moral value to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think you see that like definitely like traditionally in Europe that was certainly a case, and possibly maybe you could argue in the Middle East too, like being like when you need to protect yourself from the sun and things like that. But yeah, and it's interesting. I think it often is a climate it starts with the climate. um, but yeah. So do you think like when we're looking at, these kinds of like art that, like often when we're seeing like warriors, for example, let's talk about warriors specifically.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of funny because like there are definitely like, you definitely see like art with the men that are like they're not wearing very much clothes too, and they're like their muscles are rippling, that happens as well. But the like extent to which it happens with women is definitely more so. I think you can see that in animations too, and like just all sorts of places, like sometimes even live action films. It's like, all right, for some reason the woman has to be like less covered even though she's going to battle. And again, but and so I wonder like why that, if that's like something beyond just the genre of fantasy, or if it is like a specific problem with fantasy, or a little bit of both. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I feel like the biggest example that comes to mind for me would be like superheroes. I don't know. Would
Oh
that still count
yeah,
as fantasy if it's
yeah,
like, okay.
definitely, yeah,
There's this I've definitely seen art online where it's like there's a female superhero costume, and then they draw it on a male, and it just looks really really weird because it's like this like
yeah.
really revealing like maybe V-shaped leotard or something. Like they would draw let's see, let me Google males in female superhero clothing. What would be an example? Like if you just Google that, a lot of weird looking stuff comes up, like maybe Batman in like a Wonder Woman shaped costume, which is really weird because you're not used to Batman showing Batman, Superman, or even like, the Green Lantern. You're not used to them showing legs. So when you see it, you're like, he doesn't seem as powerful as he did, like, when he was fully clothed, which is kind of weird because like when you see Wonder Woman, I feel like you do think she's powerful. So it's just like
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, Wonder Woman is an interesting example of that, because for me, when I was younger, I'd never connected with like other versions of Wonder Woman. I know other people did, but like for me, I just was like, she felt really sexualized to me. But then when the recent movie came out, it was interesting because I know some people, like some women I know, still criticize that. They're like, why couldn't the Amazons be more fully clothed? But for me, that was like one of those, like, again, it's in the eye of the beholder, right? Like it was one of those like exceptions where when I looked at that, to me, it just felt like, well, they're not wearing much clothes, but I think it makes sense in their climate and it looks kind of comfortable and useful because it doesn't get in the way. And like, and I actually thought that was really cool and empowering and whatnot. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think when I saw the movie, I didn't like particularly have a huge problem with the clothing either. Like I feel like some of their Amazons, Wonder Woman, they were like, they had a little more on top. Like they had like one of them like had a half sleeve and like caps to their gowns, so they weren't all revealing, and like the costumes were particularly well made too. Where it was like,
Yeah,
I really just like enjoyed like looking at how they were customized. I guess I don't know how to say.
yeah. I was reading somewhere about like someone that is like a professional costume designer was like breaking this down. I think it was like a viral thread on Twitter where like many of the past movies of Wonder Woman, the costume was inspired by like lingerie versus this one was inspired by like actual Greek or Roman, I think, like Roman style like armor. Yeah. And that's probably the difference that we're noticing. Like even if we don't know that, like we don't know that kind of history, but we can kind of feel it.
Oh yeah, one of the another cool movie design recently was like the Black Panther, the guardswomen. I forget what their exact name are. What is it? Because actually, I met one of the people who were the concept artists on Black Panther.
Oh, really?
And yeah. Like, I guess it's just like a kind of a group of artists who do the concept art on a lot of the Marvel movies. So it's just really interesting. And he has like an interview online. So it's really interesting to like hear his thought process behind it. Yeah.
Yeah. Perhaps some of the reasons why we see so much of this like kind of impractical armor like in fantasy is maybe it's in the name, right? Like fantasy doesn't always have to be realistic. It can be fantastical. But it is like frustrating if when we're trying to see like these women in like powerful, these characters that are female that are supposed to be powerful, but it's like they can't have power unless it's sexualized. And like, hey, all power to people if they, if that does like they do connect with that, but it shouldn't be required.
Yeah, that's true. I think the worst offender in my mind is probably video games. Like I think even I feel like League of Legends is probably the worst example. And then even Overwatch, like my boyfriend plays that, so I'm like exposed to the character designs a lot. Like the characters are like mostly covered up, but even the body types I feel like aren't that they're always feel like sexualized. Yeah. Like it'd be cool if there were more variety of body types, like maybe a larger woman, like a skinnier woman with like a flatter chest, but for some reason they all have to have like really big boobs and stuff.
Yeah, it's like almost to proportions that would be like uncomfortable in real life, right?
Yeah, the sad thing is it's not like I know like for some of the games it's like mostly a male audience, but there are also females who play them too. So it's just like influencing like I guess how they perceive the world.
Yeah. And what kind of impact do you think that has? Like if you're and that's like on to both if you're like a girl or a woman that is seeing like yourself in these kind of ways. Like what kind of message does that send? And then also like a young boy that's playing these games, like what kind of message does that send him about and like how he would then perceive girls? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess that contributes to the whole like yeah, I feel like it could go to some pretty dark territory there. Just like,
I know, right?
Just like wanting to change your body image to fit something or just like male having like unrealistic expectations of like females. But I mean, I do know plenty of people who play those games and don't have those expectations. So it also depends on like your upbringing and stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I bet it affects different people differently. But sometimes I wonder about that. Some people get like over the top with like video games are ruining the culture, and I'm like, yeah, like it's probably like there isn't all the best evidence for some of that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a connection with like some of our violence problems in like our country and the, and then like the games that like glorify like, objectify women and like glorify certain kinds of violence. It's like,
I feel like that's been going on in entertainment media for like a while before video games, like even in comics that existed as well. Like in comics, like I guess there are lots of comics where the females don't have like proper crosses or are like super glorified and everything. It's funny though because when I was younger, for some reason I really liked this comic called Gen 13, and it was illustrated by Scott Campbell, and I still really like it till today. But when looking back on it, the characters are like super feminized and like have like really tight, awkward clothing. But I don't know, just something about the story. I thought the personalities were really fun and stuff.
Yeah, there can be exceptions, right? Okay, let's talk about boob armor.
Okay.
Yes, there are many misunderstandings about how that would work. What's your perspective on boob armor?
Oh, is it like the ones where it conforms strictly to the breast, where you can like see the individual? Yes. Is that?
Yes, I'm talking about that. Yes.
I guess personally, it doesn't really seem practical. Let's see. Yeah. They do that in some of the Marvel universes. I guess does Wonder Woman, would that count as like boob armor?
I don't know. I can't really remember what it looks like
Oh,
on her.
okay. And looking at the Marvel stuff, it seems pretty tight on her chest. I feel like, okay, I guess specifically for medieval armor, it seems kind of weird because the metal, the material of the metal has like highlights, so there usually end up being like highlights around that area, and like I feel like it should probably be more in line with like male armor where there's a giant plate in the middle. But I mean, it's down to personal preference a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. Because then if like, if it's someone wearing like something that's intentionally skin tight, then like, yeah, obviously it's gonna emphasize emphasize the boobs. But then if it's like you're saying, like the like medieval European kind of style, like armor, like there's already plenty of room there, from what I hear, right? There's already like plenty of room.
I actually haven't tried on armor, so I don't know. But yeah, it has to do a lot also to do with like the material and the reflection and where the highlights are.
Okay. What are some ways that like posing, like the way you pose a character, how that can communicate like their power or lack thereof?
Oh, that's a really good question. I know some people pose it in the way where like maybe they'll put arms closer together, so like or they just like make the, I feel like it has more to do with like how they draw the proportions of the body, because inherently I feel like the human body isn't that sexualized, you know, it's just the body. But if they draw it in a way where like the breast area or the butt area is like super big and like right in front of the camera, that makes it seem sexualized. So I don't know, I feel like yeah, it just depends like how you draw the proportions. I feel like more so than the pose. Because even like a girly pose, I feel like even if you're wearing like really, like you can be wearing heavy armor and that can still look kind of cool and strong. Like it, where like, I say girly, I mean like you know, where they're, let's see how to explain this. Like maybe they're like one leg up and then the body is slightly turned and the arms are kind of like in a stereotypical cute pose. Yeah.
Yeah, like a kind of like stereotypical feminine kind of pose. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like even that wouldn't look, you know, bad if someone just like, if they had like the right type of clothing, or it just looked, yeah, it just depends how they draw the character.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because like another side to this also is that like I think in not in fantasy but like in the real world, I hear that like women that like do have like, you know, larger proportions in those kind of areas, that it can be annoying because like just trying to wear like normal clothes sometimes it looks like they're trying to be sexy. That's what I've heard some of them say, that like it can be really annoying, and that's not their fault, obviously. It's again in the eye of the beholder. So I think there's a little bit of like, I wonder too if this kind of some of the messages in our media and in our images like contribute to that kind of assumption that like if someone does have larger chest or, you know, larger butt, that like that doesn't make them more sexual. It just makes them a person that's shaped differently. And yeah, and then so then like overemphasizing that in the way we draw contributes to that, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Just like and see it like, even if you go to like a let's see, I was like in Tokyo and I was like in their 7-Eleven and then they had a section with female magazines and I accidentally went there. I was like, oh, okay. And then I just like quickly walked away.
Yeah. So tell us what some of your creative influences are. What are the things that inspire you?
Mostly just like I guess there's two different things, like other artists, like recently I was looking up artists that had illustrated the books that I loved from childhood, and funny enough, they were female illustrators, and I was like, oh, what are the chances of that? Like Jody Lee is a really awesome one. She did all of which one? She did a lot of Mercedes Lackey books, and then Tamora Pierce. The versions that I read were done by a female illustrator too. I think her name was Joyce Patty. Yeah, her illustration is really great. And then just like, you know, nowadays just searching on Twitter or Instagram, I feel like immediately you can find really awesome art content. And then also just like hanging out with people, like hanging out with my boyfriend or my friends and doing fun things, like even if it's just going out for a bite of boba or something. Just inspiring.
Yeah, I can relate to that too. Sometimes just going out and living life can be like some of the best like sources of inspiration. Like it's like the raw stuff versus getting it from other people. Yeah, right to the source. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. How can people see your work and keep up with you?
They can subscribe to my email list on my website. That's probably the easiest way to get updates from me. And also I have a Patreon, and you can also catch me on Instagram. And I'll be live streaming this Thursday on Twitch. So a bunch of different options to find me.
Do you do that like every Thursday or?
I've started doing it this Thursday, and then we'll see if I can keep it consistent to Thursday, but I might end up moving it to Saturdays morning because I know 8 p.m. is a little late for people on the East Coast.
Okay. I asked because it'll be like a month or two, I think, before this episode goes out.
No worries. Yeah. So I guess we can say I'll just be live streaming and you can see my schedule online.
Awesome. Okay. And I'll include like the links to all those things too in the show notes.
Yeah, no worries.
Well, thank you again. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
Oh, thanks. You too. It was great being here.
That was my conversation with Kelsey Eng. Now, she and I recorded that conversation, I think it was a couple months ago, and at the time she was still kind of figuring out her live stream thing, but that is now a thing that she does every Thursday on Twitch at 8 p.m. Pacific time. So if you want to check out her live streams, you can go and find that on her website, and also include a link in the show notes below, as long as some links to all of the rest of her stuff. Now, Kelsey and I didn't get a chance to talk about She-Ra in the main episode, but we did talk about it in the epilogues. The epilogues is a second shorter show that I released to patrons only. So if you want to go and hear that, head on over to patreon.com/femalesinfantasy and click Become a Patron. Speaking of listening to things on other platforms, Females in Fantasy is now on YouTube. So if you prefer to listen to your podcast that way, you can subscribe on YouTube. And the podcast is also on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play. On the subject of illustrations, I want to take a moment to give a shout out to Mireille Gash, which I haven't done in a while, and I feel kind of bad about that. But Mireille is the one who drew the mascot character for the Females in Fantasy podcast art. She doesn't know that I'm doing this, but if you want to see more of her art, you can look at it on Instagram at cardinal_red_. And I'll include a link to that below as well. Her stuff is awesome. I especially love her character art. I mean, that's why I hired her to make a character for the Females in Fantasy podcast. But yeah, I really recommend that you go and check her stuff out. Next time on the podcast, we're going to be having a special crossover episode. L. Stephanie Tate is coming on. She is the host of Sisters of Sci-Fi, which is a podcast about female science fiction writers. And she'll be coming on to talk about what it's like to be a woman in the film industry, specifically a woman who directs science fiction films. I'm also going to be appearing on her podcast around the same time, so keep an eye out for that. And definitely go check out Sisters of Sci-Fi if you like Females in Fantasy. We're kind of like twin podcast, as we like to say. Well, until then, this has been the Females in Fantasy podcast. I am Brianna De Silva. Thanks for listening.